It is a creature of immense strength and stature. There are men and women, but all walk completely naked. They live in gorges, mountains, or forests. You can't kill them, because before they die, they will curse you, and that curse always comes true. What kind of creature is this? Every part of the world has its own legends, be it about elves, genies, or little bearded men in green suits sitting on the edge of the rainbow. In the United States and Canada, the local mythological character is a bipedal, hairy primate known by the strange name of Sasquatch. But the people of Canada assure they know how to tame Bigfoot. In the fog, you must be sure to whistle or make noise, and if someone calls from the darkness, then in no case should not go off the path. Locals are sure that in order to survive in the mountains, you need to follow these simple rules. Otherwise, you will fall prey to Bigfoot. But what will happen if Bigfoot grabs a man and takes him to his cave? Will the man survive? About all this we will tell in this video. Welcome to Wild Assault. According to witnesses, the mysterious creature is not aggressive, it just stands and watches. But many people feel unaccountable fear, as if they looked into the eyes of the devil, and the most impressionable, especially women, would immediately faint. As if in collusion, which is impossible, the witnesses paint an almost identical portrait of the stranger of the forest. He is about 3 meters tall, standing straight, no slouch, large muscles, broad shoulders, almost no neck, hairy face, huge mouth, small flat nose, sullen eyes. According to statistics, meetings with the miracle man occur in August-September, in places far from settlements, but always near the water, usually at dusk. It is during these months that forests are most often visited by hunters, mushroom hunters, and berry pickers. All witnesses give a similar portrait of this creature. Very tall, powerful, covered with thick dark hair, long arms, half-meter-long footprints, and the look. This look would make anyone feel a primal fear. And we will talk about one of the most famous captives of Bigfoot, Carl Washington. This story is exclusive because Carl didn't want to talk about it, but he told us his story. It all started in the mountains of the Himalayas. Carl was one of the most famous explorers in the region, and his dream was to find and capture the yeti, a legendary creature that lives in these parts. One day, while he and his team were exploring in the mountains, Carl heard strange sounds in the distance. They resembled roars and sounds that could not belong to any known animal. Deciding that it could be Bigfoot, Carl set out to find it. For days, he wandered the snow-covered slopes, listening to these mysterious sounds. But unfortunately, he couldn't find anything that would indicate the presence of Bigfoot. And then he decided that it was all fiction and fairy tales, and decided to return to his team and continue his research. About 10 years passed, many things changed. Carl's interests also changed. He began to appreciate nature in a different way. He liked to travel alone, far away from civilization, so he could follow his own interests and desires, not limiting himself by compromising with other people. He liked to enjoy the peace and meditation without outside stimuli. Carl felt free and independent when he was alone, and this gave him inner harmony and peace. In 1999, Carl decided to travel to Sentinel Island, officially called North Sentinel Island, one of the most understudied islands on the planet. Beautiful, tropical, green, but inaccessible to modern man. You can get there, but it's extremely difficult to get out alive. No, there aren't thousands of poisonous snakes like on Caimata Grande. It is a place of great natural beauty and remoteness. There are breathtaking ocean views, picturesque sunsets, and a variety of marine life including whales, sea lions, and dolphins. The man who transported Carl across the bay in his boat told Carl that he had picked an unfortunate spot, for a man had recently gone missing here. After hesitating a moment, he added, he was killed by a Sasquatch. Carl pretended that he had never heard of Bigfoot before and begged the Indian to tell him about him. Then, Carl smiled and said that such monkeys were found only in Russia and that all the rumors about Bigfoot were just a local legend. The Indian shook his head and said nothing. Carl agreed to pick him up in 2 weeks and went to find a place to camp. He settled under the canopy of a large oak tree with a stream running beside it. He hung his cloak and warm sweater on the branches. In the first few days, he shot a deer, cooked its meat over a fire, and enjoyed the peace, quiet, and fine weather. 6 days passed like that, but on the 7th day, Carl woke up in the morning, got out of his sleeping bag and reached for his pants, which he had hung on a branch before going to bed, but they were not there. The pants were lying on the ground, crumpled by someone, and the tin cans, which had been folded neatly the night before, were scattered. Carl thought it was a porcupine. The next night, Carl stuffed his boots into the bottom of his sleeping bag, put the canned goods in his knapsack, and hung it on a branch of an oak tree, and put the loaded shotgun next to him, just in case. In the morning, the backpack was turned inside out and put on the branch, and all its contents were under the tree. Most importantly, the carcass of a deer, soaked in cold water, disappeared into the creek. It was clearly not a porcupine in camp. What could it have been? A bear? But the animal had not touched the man. Carl looked for footprints, but found only depressions in the sand that looked like human footprints. Carl even wondered if the old Indian who had helped him into the boat was trying to scare him, but he quickly changed his mind. He gathered all the supplies into his knapsack, all intact except the hollowed-out bag of prunes. He had an idea that it could be a tribe of Indians who live on the island and decided to test his hypothesis. Carl went to the direction from which the strange sounds were coming, and after a few hours he found monkeys playing and shouting on the shore of the island. It turned out that these monkeys were creating all of the sounds that at first seemed strange and unusual to Carl. Eventually he realized that they were not a tribe of Indians, but just animals that lived on the island. But whose footprints are these? The night before, Carl decided to find the mysterious visitor by all means. At dusk, the weather worsened and clouds covered the sky. Fearing that the canopy of oak trees would not protect his belongings from the rain, Carl packed his rucksack with supplies, his rifle and knife, and his boots into his sleeping bag. In preparation for the night, he did not undress and climbed into the sleeping bag in his jacket and pants. When the first drop of rain hit his forehead, he tightened the straps of the sleeping bag and covered his face, leaving only his nose exposed. Luckily, Carl didn't have insomnia. As soon as he closed his eyes, he fell into a deep sleep. In the morning, he awoke to a cold wind blowing through his sleeping bag. Looking outside, he saw that his campfire was out. His backpack and rifle were lying nearby, and his boots were no longer on his feet, but near the fire where they were being dried. Carl realized that no one had visited his camp during the night, but he himself was alert enough to keep out unwelcome guests. In the morning, he tidied up the camp, checking every nook and cranny to make sure nothing was missing. He gathered all of his belongings, stacked them neatly in his backpack, checked the rest of his food supplies, and made sure they were in order. Carl also looked around his camp to make sure there were no clues left from the evil encroachment. He took his fishing rod, bait, and some snacks with him. The weather was beautiful, and he enjoyed the peace and quiet. With each cast of the rod, he relaxed more and more, forgetting all his worries and problems. Finally, as the sun began to sink, Carl caught his first fish. Emotions overwhelmed him, and he felt like a real winner. While the fish was roasting on the fire, he settled down on the grass and enjoyed the delicious lunch he had prepared himself. After he ate, Carl decided to take a walk around the neighborhood and explore nature. He enjoyed the beauty of the surrounding forest and listened to the birds singing and the sound of the creek. Inspired by nature, he decided to stay at this place for one more night to enjoy the solitude and peace. Although he was disturbed by those strange things, he was able to calm down and rest. Night came quickly, and Carl built a fire to warm himself before going to bed. He sat by the fire, reflecting on the previous day, his adventures, and how much he appreciated the time spent alone with nature. He settled into his sleeping bag. The night was quiet and peaceful, without adventure or trouble. Next day, after preparing breakfast and packing it in a sack to take with him on his long walk, Carl set out to find traces of the mysterious stranger. He walked around the neighborhood, examining every inch of ground and tree for clues. Carl spent the next few days gathering firewood. He went around the neighborhood looking for dry branches and trees that could be used as fuel for a fire. He looked at every tree and every bush for suitable material to make a fire. Carl used a knife to cut thick branches into pieces that would be convenient to carry. He also collected dry leaves and grass, which he used as bedding for the fire and to build a flame. The next day, Carl decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. He took with him a backpack with food and water, a rifle in case of danger, and of course his trusty knife. Carl explored the forest trails and mountain peaks. He enjoyed the beauty and tranquility of nature. For dinner, he shot his prey and cooked a roast on the fire. After returning to camp, he went to bed. Carl had a terrible dream that he had been captured by hairy monsters and sent to a remote island where he was to fight wild beasts and survive in an unfriendly environment. He felt trapped and powerless, not knowing how to get out of this nightmare. Carl woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding frantically in his chest. He realized it was only a dream, but the fear still shook in his body. To calm himself, Carl got out of bed and stepped out into the fresh air. He took a deep breath of cool air and tried to collect his thoughts. He realized that this was all just a product of his subconscious and that in reality he was safe, as if it meant something, as if the dream had been for a reason. But Carl would only realize it later. He spent the whole day hiking, enjoying the nature and forgetting about the terrible dream. He climbed to the top of the mountain and looked at the magnificent view that opened before him. The sunset was magnificent, and Carl realized that no nightmare could outshine the beauty and power of nature. He felt free and strong, ready to take on the challenge of any adversity. When night fell, Carl returned to the camp and built the fire again. He poured himself some hot tea and enjoyed the silence and solitude. His fears and doubts vanished, leaving room for calm and confidence. Carl fell asleep knowing that even if he had a terrible dream again, he would be able to overcome it and remain strong and unshaken. He was no longer lying in his sleeping bag, but hanging as if he were traveling. He was shivering. Guns and tin cans were digging into his body with their sharp edges, and he was hanging in absolute darkness. He wanted to use a knife to cut a hole in the sleeping bag, but his arms and legs wouldn't move. The sleeping bag of curls was being dragged by something large and very strong, someone's snorts and growls occasionally reaching the helpless man. Had he really been kidnapped by that huge, wild, hairy man the man spoke of? Carl asked himself this many times as he felt himself being lifted upward along with the heavy load. What confused him the most was the fact that he was armed, but could not use a gun or knife. Carl had heard about the Indians living on this island. He was told that these natives are isolated from the outside world and retain their unique culture and way of life. They refuse contact with the outside world and strictly protect their territory. There is a law against trespassing on their territory, and all attempts to contact them are forbidden. But it wasn't them. The creepiest part was when he felt his sleeping bag suspended in the void and falling downward as if he were in an elevator. The sleeping bag fell to the ground, and this elevator seemed to have reached its terminus. His body completely froze, and he found it difficult to even move. He poked his head out of the sleeping bag and breathed in the fresh air. It was still dark all around, and he could hear mumbling and talking. As dawn broke, he climbed out of the bag with his gun in his hand. In all directions, he could see the vague silhouettes of 4 huge bipedal creatures. "What do you want?" were the first words that came to his mind. Several murmuring voices rang out in response. Without moving from his seat, Carl stared at the creature standing beside him. It was clearly a family of wild men. They were all covered in fur, had no clothes, and resembled giant apes. He had undoubtedly been dragged here by their leader, an adult male 8 feet, 213 to 244 centimeters tall. His skin was covered with thick and curly dark hair. His eyes were sharp and cold, reminiscent of flashlights in the deep night. He was up to 3 meters tall. His teeth were razor sharp and glowed in the darkness of the cave. The monster's face was contorted with hatred and anger, as if he was a creature from a nightmare, ready to devour everything in his path. His old woman, a grown woman with a sagging fur sack over her chest, was clearly displeased that her husband had brought a 2-legged beast man into their home. The couple's children, a young woman and a man, were clearly frightened by the man's appearance. The female and the monster child entered the cave after the giant. The female was slightly smaller in size, but still covered in thick dark fur. Her eyes were soft and sad, unlike the anger and threat that came from the giant. She approached the hero and sniffed him, making quiet noises. The monster's baby was small and unusually cute. It was covered in fluffy fur and looked like a clumsy puppy. He approached Carl with curiosity in his eyes and started playing with the shreds of the sleeping bag, making funny noises. As it seemed to Carl, the old man, gesticulating and mumbling something, told the others how he had gotten this foreign wonder. When the sun rose, the hairy creatures left, leaving Carl alone. He looked around. There were sheer cliffs all around. Only in one place was a small V-shaped passage that led somewhere upward. Carl chose a place, dragged the rest of his belongings. Prunes, macaroni, a box of rifle cartridges, and matches had disappeared, and began to think how to get out of this mess. He still had matches in his jacket pocket in a waterproof box. Canned food could be stretched for several days. Longer than that, he could not stay here. For 2 days, the Yetis hadn't bothered him. They seemed to be watching him and all his actions from afar. It was as if he were an actor in a play or a clown, and they were his audience. Of course, Carl did not intend to stay with them, but as soon as he came to the passage in the rocks, the leader sprang up as if from the ground. The Yeti was waving his arms and mumbling threateningly something like, "Suka, suka." One could try to shoot him, of course, but any of the other Yetis could blow the man's head off with a single blow. We had to wait for the right moment. One day he woke up, but there was no one around, only heavy rain pounding on the roof of the cave. Carl decided to take advantage of this moment and tried to climb through the passage in the rocks. He knew it was his only chance to escape the Yeti's captivity. He cautiously made his way through the narrow passage, illuminated only by a small patch of light. His heart was pounding frantically and his skin was covered with cold sweat. Suddenly he heard a loud roar and a noise behind him. The Yeti realized he was going to run. Carl quickened his step, but his legs began to shake with fear. He ran a few more meters and suddenly fell, feeling a strong blow in his back. He looked back and saw a giant Yeti standing over him with a stone whip held high. He struck him on the head and everything went dark. He lost consciousness for a while, but when he awoke, he found himself in some cave, bound with ropes and unable to resist. He felt fear and despair, not knowing what would happen next. Suddenly, a giant appeared out of the darkness of the cave. It began to growl and blink its eyes, filling the air with its ominous presence. Carl closed his eyes, not wanting to see the horror that awaited him. The monster approached and began to touch and examine him, body making muffled noises. Carl felt goosebumps on his skin from the mere touch. He didn't know what the creature would do to him, but he was ready for anything. The monster slowly ran his hands over Carl's body, exploring every part of his skin. Its touch was unusually cold and gentle at the same time, causing a frightening sensation in Carl. The monster scrutinized his face, neck, chest, arms, and legs as if trying to understand his structure and anatomy. The monster's eyes were full of curiosity as it continued to touch and examine Carl's body. His skin instantly reacted to the contact, and he felt his body respond to every touch. Carl was tense and at the same time fascinated by this strange experience that he could not understand or explain. He had to come to terms with the fact that he was at the complete mercy of this monster and didn't know what would happen next. Out of desperation, Carl screamed, but his scream died down in the vast cavern, reaching no one. The monster continued its explorations as if the man was a subject of interest or expertise. Suddenly, the monster stopped and raised its head, its ears twitching to the side as if it had heard something. It then turned toward the exit of the cave and shouted something in its own language. Shortly afterward, another Yeti entered the cave, the largest of them all. He was even more impressive and intimidating in appearance than the previous ones. Carl realized that his current masters had gathered to discuss his fate. He was completely helpless and could not escape anywhere. He was willing to accept any outcome just to avoid death. The monster began talking to the big Yeti, using gestures and sounds that Carl couldn't understand. At one point, he pointed at the young monster and then at Carl. Something in his tone and gestures spoke of a decision. Carl realized that his fate was sealed. He was a prisoner of the Yeti, and his future depended solely on them. Excitement and fear filled his soul, but he was ready to accept whatever he had to endure. Carl was left alone in the dark, not knowing what awaited him next. He hung on the ropes and waited to see what would happen. His heart was pounding frantically and his thoughts were whirling around in his head. He thought of only one thing: how to escape. Carl realized that he had to get out of the cave somehow to save himself from these terrifying creatures. He began to think of different ways to escape and came up with a plan. First, he needed to free himself from the ropes he was tied up with. He began to carefully work on this using his teeth and hands. It was a long process, but Carl was persistent and focused. After he was free, he decided to check to see if all the monsters had left the cave. He stepped out of the shadows and started pacing the cave quietly, trying not to make any unnecessary noises. He heard a noise from far away, which meant that the monsters were still here. Carl decided to check the exit of the cave. He cautiously approached the entrance and peered outside. In the distance, he saw the outline of a forest and mountains, which meant that he was not that far away from civilization. He decided to take advantage of this moment and made his way out of the cave. He began to move slowly, step by step, towards the forest, trying to remain unnoticed. But when he heard sounds nearby, he didn't risk running, but returned to the cave to hide and make another escape attempt. Carl felt that his strength and endurance were his main tools in the fight for freedom. His thoughts swirled with different ways to escape, and he strove to find the safest and most effective one. He realized that he had to be persistent and clever to overcome all difficulties. However, in addition to thoughts of escape, Carl's mind was constantly spinning with the same thing. He just wanted to eat badly. He hadn't eaten in a long time, and the hunger was already unbearable. Every time he thought about escaping, his thoughts were reduced to how to find food and satisfy his hunger. Without strength, he wouldn't be able to fulfill his plan and get out of the cave. Carl realized that he had to be extremely cautious and tactful to successfully escape. He devised a plan of action. 1. Free himself from the ropes. Carl realized that he first needed to free himself from the ropes that bound him. He continued to work on this, using his teeth and hands to quickly and silently rip them off. This he did initially. 2. Find a way out. After being freed, Carl was going to carefully follow the Bigfoot's movements to the exit of the cave. He had to be undetected and avoid any noises. He also knew where he should run to. 3. Avoid obstacles. Carl was going to overcome every obstacle on his way out, whether it was other Bigfoot or dangerous traps. He was prepared for any challenge and was ready to make it to the end. 4. Run as far as possible. After being picked out of the cave, Carl was going to run as far away from the Yeti as possible to get out of their sight and get to civilization. 5. Find help. He realized that the man would have to swim to him within 1-2 days. Carl was willing to go through all obstacles and trials to get to freedom. His determination and perseverance were his strengths, and he knew he could overcome all the difficulties on his way to rescue. Carl finally decided to make his escape from the cave. He walked past the sleeping monsters, avoiding noises and not attracting attention. His heart was beating hard, but he focused and kept moving forward. When he reached the exit of the cave, he looked out and saw the outline of the forest in the distance. This was his chance for salvation. He decided to run as fast as he could to get away from the Yeti and reach civilization. Carl began to move slowly but determinedly towards the forest. He hid behind rocks and trees, trying to remain undetected. He was extremely determined to reach his goal and return to freedom. When he was close to the forest, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around and saw 2 Yetis running towards him. They had obviously noticed his escape. Carl activated and quickened his stride. He ran like he had never run before, overcoming obstacles and succumbing to traps. His heart pounded and his muscles strained to the limit. He saw his goal, the forest, where he hoped to find help and rescue. Finally, he made it out into the open and saw a man on a boat in the distance. He realized this was his chance for rescue and ran towards him, screaming and begging for help. The man spotted him and arrived at the shore. He helped Carl into the boat and swam away from the shore without hesitation. Carl was saved. Carl could hardly breathe. His heart was beating so hard it felt like it was going to jump out of his chest. He frantically tried to explain to the man what had happened to him, but it was as if his jaw would not listen. "Please, you have to believe me. I was a Bigfoot prisoner. They held me in a cave. I escaped." Carl staggered and felt himself losing consciousness. The man quickly supported him and stroked his back, trying to calm him down. "Calm down, my friend. You are safe. It's all gone. You're safe now." The man spoke soothingly. Carl closed his eyes. His thoughts became blurry. He felt himself falling asleep. "Thank you, thank you," he whispered before losing consciousness and falling into the arms of oblivion. Waking up in the hospital, Carl saw no man, no boat, no nothing. He was surrounded by white walls and strange medical devices. Carl felt a strong weakness and pain in his whole body. He realized he was in a hospital. The doctors explained to him that he had been found on the coast unconscious and badly injured. He was rescued by a local fisherman who happened to stumble upon him and brought him to the hospital. Carl was shocked and grateful for the rescue. He realized that this was a miraculous turn of events after his escape from the cave. He was alive and safe. Gradually, with each passing day, Carl recovered and found himself closer and closer to a full recovery. He realized that it was his will to survive and perseverance that had helped him overcome all challenges and overcome all adversity. When Carl was finally discharged from the hospital, he was grateful for a second chance at life. When he told the story to his doctors and relatives, no one believed him, saying that Carl had overheated in the sun.